Hi, this is Beersborn. Welcome back. We're working on our enemy 3, and we're almost done. The only thing we have left to add is a life system. Now, this is nothing new. The stuff that we cover in this video is going to be the same exact stuff that we did for enemy 1 when we were building the life system for that enemy. Now, I am going to move pretty fast in this video since we've covered it before. If you want a more slow step-by-step tutorial, go back to the enemy 1 tutorial that covers how we created the life and damage system there. But anyway, let's get started. Now, the first thing I want to do is create an instance variable for our enemy 3. This instance variable is going to be its health. You can call it HP, life, whatever you want. The type is going to be a number, and the initial value is going to be how much life this enemy has. I'm going to use 3. Now, what I can do is go over to my event sheet. I'm going to add a new event for enemy 3, and I'm going to go to on collision with another object. I'm going to select to choose whatever object I want to have that my player can use to damage this enemy. Like, for example, mine has an arrow projectile. You might have like an attack hitbox. I'm going to use the arrow. So when the enemy 3 and the arrow collide, I can add an action, go to enemy 3, go down to subtract from, and subtract from the health a value of 1. Great. Now the next thing I want to do is add an event for enemy 3 that says when the instance variable for life or for health is less or equal to 0, then I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to have my enemy 3 spawn the enemy defeat animation that we put in a previous video. So I'm going to go down to spawn another object, click to choose, and I'm going to find my enemy defeat animation. And then I'm going to add an action for enemy 3 and destroy the enemy. Now let's try it out. Every time I hit the enemy, it subtracts 1 from the life total, and then it's destroyed. Now there's a couple weird things about that. One is that you can't really tell if you're hitting the enemy or not because the arrow just goes through and the enemy doesn't react at all. And sometimes you might even hit the enemy more than once on the single arrow or a single attack. So we have to add a couple other things here. I'm going to go back to my enemy 3. I'm going to add a behavior for flash. That way we can make the enemy flash when it gets hit. I'm also going to add another instance variable. I'm going to call this one invincible, and I can make the enemy turn invincible for just a second after it gets hit. The type on this is Boolean. Good. Now what I'm going to do is go back over to my event sheet, and for this event, the collision with an arrow, I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to add an action. I'm going to make my enemy flash. We can keep these settings as is. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an action, go to my enemy 3. I'm going to set the Boolean for invincible to true. So once it gets hit, it turns invincible. And then I'm going to add an action, this time going to the system. I'm going to go down to wait. I'm going to wait 1 second. Now, after it waits 1 second, I can add another action for enemy 3 and turn invincible to false. So it's invincible, waits 1 second, and then it's not invincible anymore. Now, to make this take effect, we have to set it up so all this stuff will only trigger if it's not invincible, if invincible is false. To do that, we double click over here on the left to add another condition to this event. I'm going to go to enemy 3. I'm going to go to is Boolean instance variable set, and I'm going to do invincible. Now I have to invert this because right now all this stuff will happen if it is invincible, and I want to make this happen if it's not. So if I right click and hit invert, now on collision with an arrow, if it's not invincible, all this stuff will trigger. Now the last thing I want to add for this is that my arrow, if you're using a projectile, you might want the projectile to stop when it hits the enemy, right? Rather than going all the way through. To do that, all you have to do is add an action, go to your projectile, in my case the arrow, and destroy. So when it collides with the enemy, it's destroyed. I would recommend moving that up above the weight so that happens right as soon as it gets hit and not after that 1 second pause. Cool. Looks good. Now the last thing we could add, and we did this for enemy 1, but we didn't do it for enemy 2, we can add knockback. Knockback is if the enemy gets hit by the player's attack, it'll push the enemy back a little bit. What we're going to do is add one more instance variable. I'm going to call this one knockback, and I'm going to make it a Boolean. I also have to add another behavior. And the behavior I'm going to add is another 8 direction movement. Now we already have one 8 direction movement. Now we have 8 direction 2. The reason why I'm doing that is because we need some other kind of movement system to shove our enemy back when it gets hit. And I don't want to mess around with the behaviors that I already have set up for my enemy's random movement. So you can have as many duplicates of a behavior as you want, and they're all separate, so they won't interact with each other. So we're going to use 8 direction 2 to push the enemy for knockback, and we're going to leave the first 8 direction completely alone. Now, because we added a new 8 direction movement over here on the left window, I would recommend changing a couple things. One, set angle from smooth to no. If you keep it smooth, it's going to rotate your enemy. I would also uncheck the default controls box so that the arrow keys on the keyboard don't control your enemy's movement. Good. Now let's go back to our event sheet. I'm going to add an action to the same event, the one with the collision with an arrow. What I'm going to do is for enemy 3, I'm going to go to the set Boolean, this time for knockback, and I'm going to make knockback true. I want this to be as soon as it gets hit before the wait. So invincible and knockback, they both hit true at pretty much the exact same time right when it's hit. And then it waits a second, invincible set to false. Let's make knockback set to false also. So set Boolean, knockback, false. Good. So knockback's on for a second. Now the last thing we have to do is say what happens when knockback is true. I'm going to make a new event. I'm going to go to enemy 3, and I'm going to go down to is Boolean instance variable set. And I'm going to scroll down to knockback. So when enemy 3 is knocked back, let's add an action. We're going to go to enemy 3, and what we're going to do is use this 8 direction 2 section. Now keep in mind that we have two 8 direction 2 sections, right? We have 8 direction and 8 direction 2. We're going to be using this second one here. And what I want to use is set vector x. Set vector x can push the object in a left or right direction. Positive numbers are to the right, negative numbers are to the left. So what I'm going to do is put in 1,000 here. That'll push it at a force of 1,000 pixels per second, which in this case, for me, it's a good amount. You can always adjust this. It depends on how big your sprites are. It depends on how long the wait is here. There's a bunch of different variables here, but let's start with 1,000 and we can always adjust it later. So when it gets hit, it'll push the 8 direction back for a second. Now, the other thing I want to add here is that I'm going to disable the first 8 direction movement. When it gets hit and when it's being pushed back, I'm going to go to set enabled for this first section and make it disabled. That way it can't move based on its random movement when it's getting knocked back. Now this should work well, but the only problem is it only works if I'm hitting the enemy from the left. So it gets pushed back. But if I go over here, it pushes it towards me. What I want to do is test to see which direction I'm hitting the enemy from. And the way I can do that is by adding another condition over here on the left. I'm going to go to enemy 3. I'm going to do compare x. Compare x compares the x value, which is where the object is on the screen from left to right of our enemy, against where our main character's x is. So I'm going to start by doing the comparison for greater than. And for the x coordinate that I'm comparing to, I'm going to type in the name of my main character. My main character is called main character, but whatever you named your player character, that's the name that you would type in here. And then a period, and then x. So if our enemy's x is greater than our player's x, that means that our enemy is to the right and our player is to the left. Great. Now I can copy and paste this and reverse it so it pushes the opposite direction if the directions are reversed. So let's right click, copy. Let's right click, paste. And I'm going to make some alterations. I'm going to double click on this part. And for this one, I'm going to say if it's less than. So if my enemy's x is less than my main character, that means my main character, my player, is on the right side and my enemy is on the left. And in that case, what I'd want to do is set the vector x to negative 1,000. That'll push it to the left. Let's try it out. pushes it to the right, pushes it to the left. Perfect. Looks good. Now the last thing I'm going to add, and it's not super important, but we right now are disabling the H direction movement. That stuff gets re-enabled under the movement when a new number comes up. But hypothetically, there might be a little bit of a pause between when it gets knocked back and when the next number for the movement comes up. What I might recommend is adding one last action to this event right here. I'm going to add an action, go to enemy 3, go to this first section of H direction, and set the enabled to enabled. So as soon as the knockback is finished, the H direction turns back on. And that should do it. This is everything we need. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to add one last group. Actually, no, I'm going to make this a subgroup. I'm going to right click up here on enemy 3. I'm going to add subgroup. I'm going to call it enemy 3, call this enemy 3 life. And I'm going to move my events into that subgroup. Great. If that was too fast, refer to the enemy 1 life and damage video. I think that'll be a little bit more slow and in depth, but thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.